High school. Was pretty serious about this girl, and we had been out to eat supper and to a movie. Her dad made it clear that he wanted her home at a certain time, and I brought her home just a little bit late. And I walked her to the door, and he was waiting on us. And he told his daughter to get in the house, and then he began to give me a tongue lashing, telling me about how I should never, ever bring her home late again, that this would be my only warning, all this kind of stuff. And I did the respectful thing. I told him, yes, sir, and I left. All the way home, I was fuming, steaming mad. I walked in the door, and my mother could tell that I was upset. She said, what's wrong? And so I told her. I vented to her that he was so disrespectful. I was just a little bit late. It wasn't that big a deal. I can't believe he talked to me that way. And she just smiled and she said, you know you're wrong, right? And that made me more mad. And she said, I'm sorry, but he had every right to do that. You should know better. Who's the one person in your life that'll be honest with you no matter what? Do you have anybody like that? Now that's a little tricky because some people are honest to a fault. I'm talking about that one person that you know is going to hold you accountable, because they have your best interest at heart. They want what is best for you. And so they're not going to dance around the truth. If they know you're wrong, they're going to do like my mother did and say, I'm sorry, but you don't have a leg to stand on here. We all need somebody like that in our lives. If only you surround yourself with people who tell you how great you are and who coddle you, you're not going to do well. You know, I had a young man when I first arrived at Cord Charlotte to start coaching. This young man was in the 9th grade. And in 9th grade, that's junior high in Arkansas, okay? And this young man was about 6'4", 6'5", 210, 220 pounds. And he could play out front, he could play underneath. I mean, he was a versatile player, very good. And at a smaller school, he stood out. And I knew that he had some baggage with him. He was a little overconfident. He thought he was better than what he was, and he really needed some fine-tuning. And he came up to me one of the first practices and said, Coach, you going to move me up to high school, be on the high school team? The other coach was going to. I said, Andrew, let me tell you something. You're not good enough to play on the junior high team. Now, that wasn't entirely true, but I wanted him to think that. And so for the first 5 games, I didn't even start him on the junior high. Started a kid that was a lot worse than he was, a kid that couldn't walk and chew gum, but he wanted it. He worked hard. Tried to send that message. All his life, this kid has been coddled. He's been told how great he was, when in fact, he needed some work. He was good, but he wasn't great. It's kind of like that tennis instructor at the country club that you're paying $80 an hour to work with your kid. And then your kid goes and works out for the coach, and the coach is telling him all he's doing wrong. You're saying, well, the country club pro doesn't tell me I do anything wrong. Yeah, because you're giving him $80. Maybe that has something to do with it, right? Sometimes people are less honest, or maybe they don't tell you the whole truth for fear of running you off, for fear of maybe your reaction, or perhaps there's something else involved. We need somebody who will tell us the truth, who will be honest enough with us if we want to be great, right? The gentleman we're examining tonight was a prophet of the Lord that held nothing back. He said what needed to be said, and in the end, he proved to be a good friend. In Psalm 51, we find one of the most contrite prayers in all the Bible. It is written by a man who was broken, a man who was at the bottom. What prompted this prayer, of course, by David, was his sin with Bathsheba. Not only did he commit adultery, but he had her husband Uriah killed. And I guess that David went on thinking everything was okay. I mean, after all, he's the king. The king gets what he wants. But Nathan comes onto the scene and brings to light his sin, exposes the sin that he had been living in. I guess the crown maybe cut off the circulation to David's head, and he wasn't realizing all that he had done. But when Nathan shows up on the scene, he tells him this. He said, there were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and his children. It would eat of his bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Now, upon hearing about this moral monstrosity, David becomes incensed. In his mind, this man deserved to die for his actions, which is ironic because David deserved to die. In fact, he committed 2 offenses that were punishable by death. And then Nathan says this, "As the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. He must make restitution for the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and had no compassion." And Nathan responds with the words, "You are the man." You're the man. That is a phrase that is said as a term of endearment, I guess, in our culture. You're the man. You know, we hear that said of guys when they do something great or they accomplish something. You're the man. And I can see maybe if David were living in this culture, he might have some drinking buddies surrounding him, and after he told him everything that he had done, they might say, "You're the man. Look at you. You've got it all. Power, prestige. You got the girl now. Look at you." David was the man, but not in a good way. Nathan paints a picture-perfect portrait of someone who is dead in sin and needs forgiveness. And to David's credit, he gets it. A lot of the things that David had done to this point were egregious. They were horrible things. But give him credit. He says, "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." That's in verse 2 of Psalm 51. He owns his sin. And while I'm sure none of us would sign off on his sin, we would certainly understand, maybe even expect David to try to shift the blame or to push off the responsibility for accepting ownership for his sin. We would expect somebody in this day and age to lie about it, to deny. And if somebody catches you red-handed, you still lie about it until you have no other recourse but to say something like, "Well, I misremembered. I don't recall." Or maybe trying to gloss over it or redefine the sin in some way. That's how we operate in our culture. And if we get away with the lie at the very beginning, then we continue to build on it. Whatever it takes to absolve ourselves from any sort of responsibility and make people think that we're squeaky clean. David didn't do that, and he deserves credit for that. He immediately understands, as Nathan brings it to the forefront, his sin, and he falls to his knees, falls on his face before God. "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin." David may never have reached this point if it weren't for Nathan. This prophet acted boldly as he approached the king. I mean, this was God's message, but can you imagine approaching the king in this day and age? Can you imagine approaching the king in that culture with a message like this? You could easily be put to death. But this was God's message. And that was the overriding factor in all of this. This was God speaking to his prophet, and therefore Nathan knew he had to go and tell David the message that God had put on his heart. But also, I think Nathan loved David. And I think he wanted to see him restored, which is why he went to him as well. You know, there have been some things that have been told to me in the course of my life that I didn't necessarily like, but I benefited from. And I'm sure you're the same way. I'm sure somebody has critiqued you along the way or told you that you're wrong, and you didn't necessarily like it. But as you reflect on it, you understand that it was for your own good. Athletes are like that. A lot of times the better ones don't like to be told that they're doing something wrong or that they're not as good as they think they are. But they'll never be great unless they accept the criticism. They'll never reach another level until they understand that the criticism is for their own good. And I'm sure you've had something like that occur to you, at least more than once probably. but at least once, where someone has critiqued you, where someone has said that you are wrong, and it bothers you. But in the end, you know it was the right thing. We all need that kind of person in our lives. We all need a Nathan. Now, understand, like I said earlier, this is a little bit of a tricky concept because there are some people who love to tell you they're wrong, that you're wrong. There are people who love to point out when you're wrong. They love to criticize you. It's their spiritual gift, they think. But they don't love you. They love telling you you're wrong, but they don't love you. And there's a difference there. Some people like to be the one that tells everyone else they're wrong. Some people like to be just a sore head and point out all the faults of everybody else. That's not done out of love, and therefore that's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about that one person who is able to confront you in a loving way and say, hey, I love you, but you know you're wrong on this. You know you can do better. And of course, the approach has a lot to do with it as well, but we all need that one person in our lives that is able to do that. You see, unfortunately, love is not always the motive. But it better be when we're talking about accountability. Love should be the motive when we're talking about accountability. Accountability must be smothered in love, a love for God, a love for others. Accountability with a love for God, but without a love for people, leads to self-righteousness. That was the fault of the Pharisees. They claimed to love God, but they didn't care much for people, right? But on the other hand, accountability with a love for people, but without a love for God or His commands, leads to self-help therapy and to tolerance. And that doesn't really help anybody either. Tolerance and self-help doesn't truly help anybody if we care enough to correct. If we care enough about that person's soul, we're going to be willing to confront them and to help them, to hit it head on and seek to help them in the restoration process. You know, it's easier just to let things go. It's easier not to say anything. It's easier just to, maybe not confront it and walk away and say, well, if I say anything, it might hurt their feelings, or it may ruin our friendship. If it's a family member, it may drive a wedge between you and that family member. So it's easier to say nothing. And many people choose that course of action. Understand, folks, that's not the most loving thing to do. I mean, if we're a family, the most loving thing you can do is confront it and hold a person accountable. You don't love anyone if you're willing to ignore their sin and allow them to go to hell for fear of confronting it. We've got to be willing, as a loving family, to hold one another accountable. Many times, someone who is caught up in a sin chooses to surround themselves with people that agree with them. Maybe they choose to interact with people that are also immersed in that sin. And it makes them feel better about themselves because they get no judgment from that crowd around them. I mean, why would they judge you? They're doing the same thing. And so it's this pack mentality. As long as I stay with my pack, I don't ever have to come to terms with what I'm doing wrong. Somebody is needed in that situation, like a Nathan, to step in and say, look, this isn't right. You've got to do better. In Galatians chapter 2, we find a very interesting episode. Peter, a great apostle and pillar of the church, finds himself in the company of some influential Jews, as well as some Gentiles. And though Peter knew that Gentiles had the same standing in the kingdom, that there was no social status, Peter acted like a hypocrite. He was being arrogant and aloof as he rubbed elbows with the Jewish elite and looked down his nose at the Gentiles. In other words, Peter was wrong, and Paul knew it. And Paul didn't hesitate to call Peter out. And in verse 11 and following it says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, which the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? First of all, I want you to notice that Peter was committing the sin of hypocrisy and that his actions caused collateral damage. He was causing others to act in hypocrisy as well. Even Barnabas, the great encourager, can you imagine? He was carried away even. That's the first thing. Secondly, I want you to notice that Paul had the courage to confront. Paul pulled no punches in calling out Peter in front of those that he had led astray. I mean, this was a public sin, so he calls him out in front of the people that he also led astray. He rebukes Peter before all of them, pointing out his hypocrisy. Now, if we're not careful, we get the idea that Paul didn't much care for Peter. But that's only because we put ourselves in Peter's sandals and we say, I wouldn't let somebody confront me that way. Ain't nobody going to talk to me that way. Even if I'm wrong, they better approach me better than that. They better respect me, right? Well, that's because we concentrate as much on the approach as we do the wrong that we've done. In fact, more so probably, right? That's another one of those blame shifters. I take the focus off of myself. I put it on the one who's doing the critiquing or the holding of accountability, and I kind of take it off myself. Peter knew he was wrong. Paul knew he was wrong. And so he confronts him in front of all these folks. Was Paul loving in his actions? May not seem that way at first, but you'll see here in just a minute that he was. And thirdly, I want you to notice Peter's reaction. In 2 Peter 3, 14 through 16, he writes this. He says, therefore, beloved, since you look for these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless and blameless, and regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do the rest of the Scriptures also, to their own destruction. I mean, Peter's respect for Paul had not diminished. In fact, it may have grown even more. He refers to Paul as our beloved brother. He acknowledges Paul's wisdom. Peter allowed Paul's rebuke, I believe, to make him better. He humbly acknowledged Paul's wisdom in that situation, and he did so publicly. You'll also notice that Peter's humility is a product of love. Just as Paul was rebuking out of love, Paul loved Peter, I believe. He loved him as the Lord loves the church, which is why he had the courage to say something. You know, two things make accountability really hard. The approach, which is usually done in a lack of love, and pride. You know, it's hard to help someone if we confront them in the wrong manner. If we don't confront them out of love, it's really going to be hard to get the message across to them that they need to do something different. But it's also pride on the recipient that makes it hard as well. When a person's so full of pride that they won't come to the conclusion that they need help, that they need someone to hold them accountable. These two things make it extremely difficult, but they shouldn't keep us from doing what needs to be done. Here's the question for all of us. Who's your Nathan? Who is that one person that you know loves you enough to hold you accountable? And I'll give you the answer. Look around you. It's everyone here. Should be anyway. Everyone in this congregation should be your Nathan. Because we are a family and because we share the same spiritual DNA, we should all be willing to love one another enough to hold one another accountable. Now again, we're talking about things that truly matter, okay? I mean, it's not like the gentleman that comes to church and he's visiting and he's never been there before and he comes in and he sits down with his cowboy hat on. And the little lady who is steeped in tradition goes up to him and says, "Take your hat off. What are you doing wearing a hat in the building? What do you want to accomplish there?" You want him to come back? Because he's probably not. I mean, is that a hill you want to die on? In her mind, she was holding him accountable, but only to a tradition, right? And listen, a tradition I respect, but still, nevertheless, we're talking about things that matter. We're talking about spiritual accountability here. And this should be a place where we come to be encouraged, to be stimulated to love and good deeds, as we've been talking about on Sunday morning, but also a place where we can be held accountable so that we can all arrive in heaven someday, right? Galatians 6, 1 and 2, it reads, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ." Paul is pointing the finger right at you, right at me. He says, you who are spiritual. That's you. That's every Christian. That's every church member. You who are spiritual, you have an obligation to bear one another's burdens. And of course, the burdens he's talking about here are spiritual burdens. Specifically, when someone is dealing with sin. We're all in this together. We're all a family of God's children striving to live righteously in an unrighteous world. We are laborers in the vineyard sharing the gospel message. We are a body of Christians who are trying to please their Heavenly Father. And sometimes we fail. And sometimes we need some help recognizing our failure. But all the time we should be a family. There to pick one another up, to help us regain our footing. That is what family is for. We're there to love each other through the hard times, to weep with those who weep, to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to hold each other accountable if need be. Wasn't that the problem of the Laodicean Christians? You remember their plight in Revelation chapter 3? They were lukewarm, and Jesus says, I will spit you out of my mouth. He says, I'm going to come and remove your lampstand if you don't repent and turn around. And you read that and you think, who was there to step up? Why didn't somebody step up and say, folks, we got to change here? Maybe they did. And people just wouldn't listen to them. Maybe there was that one person that says, folks, we got to do better. And nobody listened to them. Somebody should have, right? Somebody should have stood up. Story is told of a gentleman who died, and he, as the fictitious tales go, he arrives at the pearly gates, and Peter is standing there, right? And he gets there, and Peter says, I've got to tell you something. We've been looking over your records, and you really hadn't done anything real good or real bad. We're kind of on the fence about you. Can you tell us anything that might sway us one way or the other? And he said, well, I once saw a woman who was being bullied by a bunch of bikers. So I pulled off to the side of the road to help her out. And I got out my tire iron, and I went up to him, and I told him, if you don't leave this woman alone, you're going to have to deal with me. And Peter said, really? When did this happen? He goes, about 2 minutes ago. Some of you will get that on the way home. We're all held accountable to God. And therefore, we should all hold one another accountable. We shouldn't want anyone to leave this life and enter into eternity unprepared because we didn't say something, because we were afraid to approach the issue. Again, this is a tricky thing, but it's vital. Let's make certain that we are a people who love one another enough that when we see one who is bearing a burden, or maybe someone who's not even bearing the burden but needs to, that we're willing to sit there and point it out, to give them a hug, to comfort them, to help them in the restoration process, and like Nathan say, you're the man, and we want to help you. And maybe you're in that situation tonight. Maybe you're the man or the woman who is in deep despair because of sin in your life. Maybe you need the help and support of this church family. Maybe you're seeking restoration. Maybe you're someone who has been a slave to sin for so long you're ready to do something different. We want to help you with that as well. Don't leave here tonight without doing something about your soul. And if the invitation's not for you, then let's leave tonight ready to change the world this week and come back next Sunday. If you have a need tonight we can help you with, Stephen's going to lead a song. Come now as we stand and as we sing.